So let's go ahead and take a look at the iPad mini 3 and see how the specific iPad holds up in 2023. Now, what's funny is that this iPad came off right off the heels of the iPad mini 2, and it was probably one of the smallest iPad updates we've probably ever seen in our lifetimes. So I will break down whether this iPad is worth buying or not. Spoiler alert, it's not worth buying. But if you want to buy some iPads I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description. You can get that from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPad mini 3, actually let's start off with the concept of this iPad. This is basically Apple's, cheaper lineup, but it's not really supposed to be a cheaper iPad. It's supposed to be one that's a good size, that's a small size for a lot of people, and that's pretty much available all the time. You don't have to wait in line for it, and it's not super expensive. So that's something I always appreciated about the iPad mini lineup, and this one was no exception. Now on the front, you had a familiar design. It was a 7.9-inch IPS LCD panel. The resolution was quite high for what type of device you were getting here, to be honest, and it looks like a pretty good iPad. I still think it looks pretty good. There's really not a lot to complain about here, but it isn't until you start looking at basically what came with this iPad compared to the iPad mini 2, that's where things start getting a little bit more complicated. Mostly because this iPad on the front pretty much was almost identical to the iPad mini 2. The only thing that even changed was that this thing got Touch ID on the front. Now, that is kind of a big deal in my opinion, but I don't think it would be that big enough of a deal for me to switch over from my current iPad, if I had an iPad mini 2, to this specific one. I think I probably wouldn't have even thought about getting this iPad. Touch ID is great, but I don't think it's worth spending extra money just to go and get that type of feature. So that was always something that kind of stood out to me. And in this case, that was basically what you were paying here. I mean, it was kind of funny they could even sell a new iPad like that, but that was really one of the main things they changed. Now on top of that, you were also getting, still the lightning port at the bottom. You're getting your headphone jack at the bottom too, which is great. And on the back, you're getting your standard aluminum build. So this was great because, Apple, like I said before, has never really made a cheap iPad. The back of this thing, the front of this thing still looks great. And I still think it looks like a pretty good looking iPad. Now you have that single camera setup on the back as well, which we'll talk about in a second. And basically that was it. There really wasn't a whole lot else that Apple was kind of doing here. It looks like a pretty standard iPad, as you may have already, kind of saw. But I don't think that was a bad thing. I think that's kind of a good thing. This thing design-wise looked good. And I will tell you, maybe this iPad looked identically the same as the other iPad. I'm still really happy that Apple went ahead and, at least brought over an iPad like this, because it needed Touch ID. I guess it needed a little bit of refresh. So I think that was a kind of a nice thing. So in terms of the outside, that kind of covers it up there. Now in the camera department, like I said, this thing on the back had a 5 megapixel standard camera, and on the front it had a 1.2 megapixel camera. Now, remember when I told you that this thing really wasn't that big of an upgrade from the Mini 2? It was quite clear in the camera as well. So this iPad came out in 2014. Was the same exact year that the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus came out. So that thing had an 8 megapixel camera on the back. So with this one having a 5 megapixel camera on the back, it really wasn't that big of a difference, to be honest. Yes, it was way more megapixels you were getting on there, but you were still only getting 1080p on the back and 720p on the front on the latest iPhone that came out. And this thing could more or less do the exact same thing. So this iPad, for the time that it came out, it wasn't significantly, way behind. And that's something you have to kind of remember. If you were getting something like the iPad mini 3, well, clearly you weren't getting the most expensive iPad of that time, but you were still getting an iPad that had a camera during that iPhone's camera, which was one of the more expensive phones at the time. So kind of, keep it through the lens of that. I will tell you though, with this specific iPad, the camera really isn't that great. I mean, it can probably take photos if you wanted to, or videos, but if you have an iPhone 6S or newer, your camera in your phone is going to be better than this specific iPad. So I'm going to say that again. If you have an iPhone 6S or newer, literally even an iPhone 6, honestly, even an iPhone 5S or newer, your iPhone is going to be better than this specific camera on this iPad. So it makes even less sense to go ahead and buy an iPad like this, in my opinion. And that's just something you have to kind of keep remembering. So all in all, from the camera department, this specific device doesn't really make too much sense to buy anymore, especially if you're planning on using an iPad that is still kind of even relevant or supported. This is definitely not one I would recommend buying. So from that perspective, that kind of covers it up there. Now in the software perspective, this specific thing released originally with iOS 8.1, but you were able to get iPadOS 12.5 5 on it, whatever the latest version of 12.5 was. And I think that's a pretty cool thing. For this thing to have lasted that long is awesome, and I always love seeing these iPads getting, support for many, many years. In this specific case, it's been unsupported for many years now. So it makes even less sense to buy an iPad like this, and that's just something you kind of have to keep coming back to. There isn't really a huge point of buying an iPad that's already been unsupported for so many years. It makes way more sense to go ahead and buy an iPad that is still supported and is still going to be supported probably for the next, at least like 2 years. Even if you want to buy an iPad that's only supported for 1 year longer, that's totally fine. But to buy an iPad that has already been unsupported with software for many, many years, I think since 2019 this thing's been unsupported, it doesn't really make, maybe even 2018, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to buy an iPad like this, if I'm being honest. It makes a lot more sense to go ahead and buy an iPad that is still supported, that's still around, and is still relevant. And this thing makes no sense to buy at all. In fact, a lot of applications may not even be really supported on this version of software anymore either. So that's just another case in point. Just probably avoid buying this phone, just avoid buying this iPad in my opinion. Now moving on to the performance side of things, the internals of this iPad were more or less the same of what you were getting on an iPad mini 2. So you had an Apple A7 chip inside of it with a 1 gigabyte of RAM. Now during that moment, this wasn't that far behind. It had the same chipset as an iPhone 5S for the most part. And if you think about it, the iPhone 6 also had 1 gigabyte of RAM. So during that time, this wasn't that bad of a device. Like it wasn't like a no-brainer, to avoid this device. It was pretty much the same thing you were buying on that latest iPhone, and the iPhone 5S I'm sure was probably still being sold at that moment too. So the performance pretty much matched in line with an iPhone 5S during that moment. Now you can do very, very basic things on this iPad nowadays. It's very slow, it is very glitchy, and that's just not a good time to have. You don't want to go and buy an iPad that's already glitchy, that's already slow. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to go down that direction. It makes a lot more sense to go ahead and buy an iPad that is still going to be relevant for a little bit of time. And basically with an iPad like this is where you're kind of getting into those tiny issues. So from my perspective, if I were to go ahead and buy an iPad like this, it probably would not be this one, but if it were to, I would expect to have massive glitched frames, massive slowdowns, games not being able to perform that well, applications not being able to open, completely, or maybe they just glitch when they open, things like that. It would still work, it would still be a working device, but it just would not be that great of an experience because things would just be so glitchy. So when I think back to using this iPad, or even when I'm using this iPad to record the videos with, it's just a glitchy experience. And even the software updates, I feel like iPadOS 12 tried to do its best to fix things that iPadOS 11 kind of messed up with, but even then you can only do so much. So to kind of sum up this video, what I'll tell you is I really don't think this iPad is worth buying at all in any capacity. Unless you could buy a brand new sealed one to keep as a collector's item, this iPad isn't worth buying anymore at all. I would much rather prefer you buying something like an iPad mini 5, and iPad 8th generation would probably be good. You don't have to spend all your money on the latest iPads, but those are just some of the used ones that I think are pretty solid. Even an iPad 7 generation will probably be better than this thing in my opinion. In fact, it'll be way better than this iPad. So those are just basically my thoughts on this iPad. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.